Hey everyone, let's talk about A Moveable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. I read the restored edition from 2009 and not the 1964 edition, but I'll get to that later. Let's talk about the book first, because we did have some struggles. This is the story of basically Ernest Hemingway's years in Paris in 1920 to 25, something there, the early half of the 1920s, where he was just beginning his writing career and living in Paris, writing and hanging out with a lot of people. It's more or less short essays and stories about events and people he met and stories and experiences he had. So it's not an ongoing flow of story, but more different parts and scenes described. It's memoir style, and I think the most problem I had was with the writing. In the beginning, when I started the book, I had a huge problem reconciling the voice of the narrator, which is Ernest Hemingway, with the things I had heard about Ernest Hemingway by others in movies, other memoirs and things. So I was struggling there because the voice in the beginning is very young and very naive, and it all sounds like a love letter to Paris. And even though that sounds very nice, I really had a hard time imagining that being Hemingway, which of course is not fair because all I heard was, of course, hearsay how other people saw Hemingway, and this is how he maybe saw himself at the end of his life, looking back at the beginning. So I can't really fault him for that. Moving on, I really enjoyed what he was talking about. I really got to liking his enthusiasm for Paris and writing and the time he spent writing, how he organized his life around that, his time with his first wife and the adventures they had, how he portrays that as rather endearing. Also, the other characters he has interactions with, like Gertrude Stein, Ford Maddox Ford, Ezra Pound, Scott Fitzgerald, all these people that were also in Paris at that time. And it is rather interesting to hear from his point of view the things he thinks about them and about their experiences and the interactions they had. From that point of view, I really enjoyed this book. I still have problems saying I really loved the book. I think for me, it is an interesting book that could have become really more interesting if I wanted to follow him around. He's very descriptive of where he lives and where he moves and where he goes for drinks. So if you wanted, you could follow him around and map out his time in Paris a lot. You could also look up all the other people he knew and what they said about him. So I think it's a book you can get lost in researching more and references and other characters to get more out of this. That I think I didn't want. And that's a thing that I also struggled with because alone it was interesting, but it wasn't captivating for me. And since I didn't really get along with the writing, even later on, there is something about the writing that I really, yeah, it was like a barrier for me. I didn't get lost in the writing. And I like that when I read memoirs and people telling stories of their lives, when you can get lost in it and you feel like you're there with them. But oftentimes I didn't feel that here. I felt him being judgmental or overly critical or mean, even though he tried to present himself as a very good person. And that also is something you could get lost in thinking about. But I kind of didn't want to. So the things I had problems with, I think is not the fault of the book. What I think the book does really well is make you curious about picking up a pen and going to Paris and just sit in cafes and write and being part of that enthusiasm that they all felt at the beginning of the 1920s, where they didn't really have that much money, but were trying to sell their stories and were taking their work seriously. And it really makes you wish you could do that as well. And it also makes you think about a lot of what writing is and the process of writing, which I think this edition does really well. Now here comes the difference. In 1964, there were a lot of changes made to the manuscript that Ernest Hemingway himself prepared because it was published posthumously and no one really knows what his final edition would have looked like. But this edition really deals with that. It includes beginnings for an introduction that he discarded but has never finished writing. It also includes lost or not included chapters in the 1964 edition. It also addresses changes that were made to the 1964 edition, which I thought was very interesting. So if you already read the 1964 edition and really enjoyed that, I highly recommend picking this up as well. If you want to reread it and experience the story again, I think getting the restored edition with the extra foreword and introduction and the extra snippets of his writing will give you another benefit into looking into how he wrote, because you can see how he changed little things and what he tried with different forms. That's, from a writing perspective, super interesting. And yeah, I highly recommend this edition for that. I think it's also worth getting a Moveable Feast for the experience of being in Paris in the early 20s with all the other writers and getting a perspective that I hadn't heard before, because I hadn't heard Hemingway's perspective on those years before. So for all of that, it was a good read. It was a wonderful read for me, but I do appreciate it, and I'm glad I finally read it. Now I want to hear, I know of course a lot of people love this book, and I want to hear what you love about it. Tell me in comments, tell me if you read the restored edition or if you have read the original version, which is apparently shorter than, which this is already short. Anyways, let's talk in comments about Hemingway. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.